So. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar from the INSITE program, second in the series. The INSITE program has been looking at some of the fundamental science questions needed to understand the influence and the value of structures in our marine environment over the last 10 years. My name is Henk van Rijn. I'm on the INSITE program director team, and I'm going to introduce the webinar today. But before we go into the presentations, I wanted to make a point about the use of science in decision making. Those in government who are making decisions are invariably dealing with multiple and competing interests, and their decisions need to be made in a transparent, accountable, and proportionate way. Science plays a critical role in informing decision making and enabling action, particularly in identifying alternatives and clarifying the costs and benefits of particular courses of action, so the policymakers can choose between them. What we've been doing in the INSITE program over the last few months, and will continue doing over the next 12 months almost exactly, is to work closely with policymakers to identify where INSITE science can support their work. INSITE is coming to the end of its second phase. Many of you who will be familiar with the program, it's worth saying that when INSITE was set up, it was the first real joint industry partnership of its kind in the UK marine research. And its aim has always been to provide stakeholders with independent scientific evidence to better understand the influence of man-made structures on the ecosystem of the North Sea. I'm not going to go into this slide in any detail, but I just wanted to show you the breadth of work that's undertaken in the science program of INSITE. We're looking at topics as broad-ranging as foraging by marine predators, testing the limits of the UK autonomous fleet, understanding fish aggregation, blue carbon benefits, developing AI to speed up the understanding of biodiversity associated with marine structures, and investigating the effects and implications of subsea plastics incorporated into marine structures. The focus of the webinar today is to share insights from projects across the program on environmental restoration and net gain considerations that are associated with structures in the marine environment. So to clarify what we mean by environmental restoration, we can define this as a process of promoting the recovery of an ecosystem from a degraded state. It can deliver for ecosystems, habitats, and species, or it can prioritize outcomes for each individually. Environmental or ecological restoration can also improve the condition of habitats, expand their size, and connect them with other habitat patches. And from the latest government consultation on net gain can be defined as an approach to development that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. This means protecting, restoring, or creating environmental features that are of greater ecological value to wildlife, habitats, and people than any losses associated with the original project. So to start us off and to introduce the topic, we're very fortunate to have Charlotte Johnson from Natural England provide us with some background to marine net gain and evidence that Natural England are working on to support DEFRA in their development of marine net gain policy. This is for consideration alongside the research findings from the INSITE projects. Then we will hear from three of our INSITE investigators. First to talk will be Professor Joanne Porter from Heriot-Watt University, then Dr. Stephen Watson from Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and then Professor David Patterson from the University of St Andrews. Finally, I will host a short question and answer session towards the end of the webinar, where there'll be opportunity for you to ask our speakers any questions that you have about the talks today. You'll all be muted throughout the webinar, but you can ask questions or comment as we go along using the question and answer tab, the Q&A tab in the Zoom tab at the bottom of your screens. You can upvote any questions that you like, and these will highlight them as more interest for taking on in the question and answer session. One final note before we hear from our first speaker is that in addition to this webinar being recorded, a live illustration will be carried out alongside the talks and the question and answer session. We'll give you glimpses of this as we go along, but the final images will be made via the website. So we hope you enjoy the webinar, and I will now move on to our first speaker. That's Charlotte Johnson. So Charlotte, moving on to you.
Good morning, Hank. Good morning, everyone. I'll just share my screen. There we go. Give me a shout if you can't see a marine net gain screen with some nice mussels and kelp in the background. No, all good. Okay, thank you very much for having me to speak today. So I'm Charlotte Johnson. I work at Natural England and I'm a marine senior specialist there, and I'm leading on our marine net gain work. This is quite a new area for Natural England in terms of marine net gain specifically. We're a very small team. There's just 4 of us. I have oversight from a principal specialist of Chris McMullen, and I work alongside Eddie Mayhew and Emma Jane Bagnall, who's new to the team. So there's just the 4 of us developing this work area at the moment. And Hank asked me to just give a little bit of a background on net gain and what we're doing in Natural England on our marine net gain work. So what is net gain? As Hank's already kind of mentioned, net gain is an approach which aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. This is a policy that's been developed terrestrially to start with. So their biodiversity net gain policy, which will be mandatory from November this year, applies down to mean low water, so includes those intertidal habitats as well. And we've been looking across to that policy, also through to marine, to understand what we could do in the same way to leave the environment in a measurably better condition. This just highlights that net gain. So you've kind of got rid of all your residual impacts to no net loss, and then that net gain is that additional benefit on the top of that. Hank mentioned that DEFRA consulted on high-level aims and principles of marine net gain last year, and they've provided a summary of these responses, which you can find on their website. And they will be providing a response to the consultation this year as well. The driving force behind the development of this policy, as we understand it, are these items on the screen in front of you. So the British Energy Security Strategy, marine spatial prioritisation, the development of offshore wind, and greater kind of blue-green development in our marine environment. 25-year environment plan. All of these policies and strategies give that impetus to develop this marine net gain in order to leave our environment in a better state than we found it after development. So what are we doing in Natural England to help DEFRA, kind of provide DEFRA with evidence and advice on this policy? We've got a number of projects that are ongoing and some that have delivered already. The ones that have delivered already, we have a report looking at how we define irreplaceable marine habitats. So these would be habitats that we really would want to strongly advise that development didn't occur on, because if they're irreplaceable, you can't kind of restore them or recover them or enhance them. So that project, I can provide links to these projects at the end of the call if required. That project has just completed and been published, and we also provided, we commissioned a report looking at assisted versus natural recovery, so understanding where it's better to actively intervene and try and restore habitats, and where it's better to just stand back and remove pressures and allow the habitat to recover. 2 other projects that are still ongoing are my colleague Eddie Mayhew is leading a project looking at exploring metrics to measure losses and gains in the marine environment in terms of understanding how we could measure those gains for marine net gain. And then finally, a project that I think would be most relevant and most interesting to those present on this call is MARIPO, which stands for Marine Restoration Potential. So we looked at where we could potentially restore marine habitats that we knew were threatened and declining using the OSPAR threatened and declining list of habitats. It links through to the Environment Agency-led project project Rememory, if you've heard of that one, and is a joint project led by Natural England with funding from Natural England and also the Crown Estate's OEC programme. And it brings together Natural England, the Environment Agency, Guernsey and CFAS, who all delivered parts of this project. And we looked at the restoration potential of merle, modiolus, sea pens, kelp and offshore oysters as well. This project is currently being reviewed at the moment and hopefully should be published in the coming months. That's just an outline of some of the habitats that we looked into for this. I've talked about those projects already and I don't want to overrun, so yeah, thank you very much for your time. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you, Charlotte, for whistle-stop tour there of some of the work in Natural England and that is going on to advise and influence the development of policies in this area. It's really interesting and good to know about that. If we move, what we'll do now is move on to the first of our Insight speakers, Professor Joanne Porter from Heriot Watt, who's going to talk to us a little bit about environmental restoration work coming out of the Insight programme. On to you, Joe.
Thank you, Henk. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, all good.
And can you see the screen?
Yep.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk this morning briefly about the work we've been doing in the Chassands project in relation to environmental restoration, ecological enhancement aspects. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join with the webinar today. As you know, the aim of the INSITE programme is to enhance understanding of the connectivity of hard substrate epifaunal populations across artificial substrata in the North Sea. And the particular relevance of Chassands is to INSITE's challenge number 1, which is looking at the role of man-made structures as an interconnected hard substrate network. And just to dive straight in, the part of the work that we've been doing more recently that's very relevant to this agenda of restoration and ecological enhancement is the connectivity analysis that's been undertaken by colleagues Michaela de Dominicis and Ben Barton at the National Oceanography Centre in Liverpool. So Michaela and Ben have been developing particle tracking models for the central part of the North Sea and releasing particles around about the area of Orkney, Pentland Firth and the sort of north of Scotland, and then tracking to see what happens to these particles over a series of months, with trials going on for 90 days of dispersal. You can see a series of images here showing the start points and the end points of the particles over time. And what this is allowing us to do is to understand when particles are released, where might they end up and how long does it take them to get there for a range of different hard substrate species. And we've been drilling down into this in detail to try and understand both spatial patterns and temporal patterns. And in terms of the spatial findings that are starting to emerge now, we're starting to understand from that areas of sinks and areas of sources across this central region of the North Sea. And in terms of temporal variability, we're starting to understand what's happening at different times of the year. And some of the findings that have more recently been coming out from the work is that coastal sites have better connectivity during the winter months, whereas the offshore sites that we're studying have a possibility to connect sporadically all the year with each other. And we're finding that coastal sites connect with offshore sites better during the summer months. And this was an example year where the model parameters were taken from 2017 data. So how is this kind of work that we're doing useful for helping to inform oil and gas decommissioning and offshore wind infrastructure development in relation to restoration and enhancement? As you know, at the moment, the requirement in the North Sea is for full removal of old infrastructure, and this has already started to happen. An example here is the Geider field in Norway, which was closed in 2020, where rigs were removed for dismantling and recycling of the steel. But there are other options, as we are aware, and there's been a really nice review published in 2019 about the options, a review of practices and reefing options. And this slide just shows 3 of the different types of reefing methods that could be used: tow in place, platform reefing, topple in place, platform reefing, and partial removal and then resetting on the seabed as reef options. But what about the additional enhancement opportunities that could have good potential? And some of the material that gets left behind when we do a decommissioning operation, for example, things like shell mounds, are the possibilities for additional enhancements as part of this decommissioning process. And obviously the commissioning of new infrastructure process as well. So let's just think for a moment about the sequence of marine restoration and enhancement. First of all, we need to prevent the activities. And then we move into a phase where we're actually removing pressures that have been applied to that environment, that location. And then we've got the option of a type A, eco-engineering, perhaps also using geoengineering. So this could be a scenario where you create habitat and environmental conditions and the species come back. Or you could have type B, eco-engineering, where you have to give a helping hand by restocking, replanting or reseeding. What we do know is this sequence works better in the inshore and estuarine areas than in the open sea. We know that eco-engineering is challenging at sea due to the difficulty of manipulating ecosystems. However, capping with new different sediment types or modules could potentially be workable. I've summarised very briefly in this table scenarios, advantages and disadvantages. We can't really go into this in detail today, but there are advantages of each of the different options that we should consider quite carefully in the context of restoration and ecological enhancement. And one case example I wanted to bring to your attention was the work by Meyer Gutbrod et al. 2019. And they looked at the decommissioning impacts on biotic assemblages with shell mounds beneath Southern California offshore oil and gas platforms. And quite a lot of detailed information was gathered around the biomass density, species composition and similarity at 22 Southern California platforms. And these results are now being used to inform a comprehensive net environmental benefit analysis of Southern California offshore platform decommissioning alternatives. So looking at some wider considerations, there are costs to including ecological enhancement, but there could be reductions of decommissioning costs if all materials don't have to be removed at the decommissioning stage. Also worth considering that the supply chain for ecological enhancement would need to be scaled up. Experienced offshore workers and aquaculture jobs would be needed to support this type of work. Also, I don't think it's fully understood at the moment the carbon footprints of the decommissioning process and the ecological enhancement process. How do these things compare? But there are some interesting linkages as well. Refuge areas of diversity can provide connectivity between fragmented habitats, and this can better support the marine protected area network, for example. And there's been a recent paper published by Mackenzie et al. In 2022 talking about these aspects, which might be of interest to the audience here. And it's also interesting to note that there's developments in the aquaculture side for some of the species that might be used for the enhancement, making that more possible now than perhaps it has been previously. What we do need to see is authentic corporate social responsibility. And several of these aspects are also raised in a new paper that's due to be published in June 2023, which is an offshore decommissioning horizon scan. And this talks about the research priorities that are needed to support decision-making activities for what happens with oil and gas infrastructure. And this is now available as a preprint. So just coming back to the work we've been doing in the Chassands project, what we are able to do is predict by particle tracking the movement of larvae from sources to sink areas in the central North Sea. We're also testing this in situ with settlement panel experiments and genetic analysis. Information exists regarding locations of infrastructure that's due to be decommissioned, and forecasting is being used to predict where new infrastructure is likely to be deployed. And the nice thing about all this is that we can combine these information streams to help inform about the likely success of restoration or enhancement across the central North Sea area and the impact of new deployments. And this type of approach could be used in future to assess other parts of the North Sea, other regions. Just coming back briefly to touch on the potential policy linkages. Charlotte's already spoken about the biodiversity net gain. There's also the MMO strategic plan, and that talks about restoring well-functioning ecosystems, what ecosystems are needed, where are they needed, can and should they be co-located, how long does it take for them to become established and functioning. And as I mentioned briefly, there's also the Marine Protected Area Network connectivity enhancement. So concluding thoughts. What ecosystem services and functions do we want the North Sea to have in coming years? There are options to enhance carbon sequestration, biodiversity and nursery site services at actual decommissioning sites would need to be scoped out. And we're starting to see some scientific evidence coming through biodiversity gain. And it was really useful to see those different projects highlighted by Charlotte. And a recent paper, which might be interesting as well, is about oyster bivalve biogenic reef biodiversity gain. And a nice example as well about offshore wind farms and seaweed culture is this About Amazon project, which I've put the link for there. So just to finish, I wanted to say, there's an option, I think, here, an opportunity for some decommissioning demonstration enhancement projects. And it would be interesting to discuss where these could be located and who would be interested partners for driving forward these kind of projects. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Joe. It was a really interesting talk covering sort of the eco-engineering aspects and then some of the particle tracking research you've carried out. It's already generating some questions. So that's really great. Thank you for that. We move on to our next speaker, please. Stephen Watson, I believe you were the lead author of the paper that Joe was referring to.
No, so, not me. It's a different Watson.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
No, it was worth a punt. Sorry.
It's worth a go. I can't claim it though.
You can't be everywhere, but you're with us now, and I believe you're going to be focusing more on the net gain aspects. Look forward to that now, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Hank. I'll just share my slides. So hopefully you can all see them and hear me. If not, please shout. So hi everyone, thanks for inviting me. I'm Dr. Stephen Watson from Plymouth Marine Lab. I'm going to talk today about some thoughts around environmental net gain, ecosystem services and policy. I'm going to be talking from two different projects which I'm working on in my capacity as an ecosystem service scientist. I'll be mainly talking about the DREAMS project and the INSITEs projects, which are collaborations between PML, the University of Plymouth and CFAS. So just to introduce you a little bit to the projects, DREAMS, which stands for the decommissioning of, decommissioning effects of alternative management structures. So in DREAMS, we're going through and taking asking what does the scientific literature tell us around different decommissioning options. This is going through, we're using various evidence synthesis-based approaches, whereas in the INSITEs synthesis project, we're taking a slightly different approach where we're asking what scientists think about the effects of structures and what effect will these structures have at the end of their life. So they're two very kind of different projects. I also want to talk in this talk a little bit about a third project called UKIRK, where I'm currently the deputy co-director, where this time, rather than asking scientists, we're actually asking developers, stakeholders and arm's length bodies what they think about offshore structures and what to do with them at the end of their life. So the thrust of my talk today is, can we build some consensus between these three different approaches, specifically relating to restoration, environmental net gain and ecosystem services. So we heard at the start from Charlotte a little bit about net gain, but I just wanted to go back and talk a little bit about why environmental net gain in particular is important. Currently the UK is pushing for biodiversity net gain, but it's equally important that we begin to think about the wider benefits that might come from biodiversity. And the DEFRA consultation, which was mentioned earlier, highlights that we should be thinking a bit further about how we should be including things like natural capital ecosystem services. So there really is a need, I think, to go beyond biodiversity net gain and start thinking about things like how carbon capture storage, climate change, health and well-being may be integrated into biodiversity net gain. So this is just the aims and objectives of the three different projects. I put little blue banners so you can see about which project I'm talking about. But I'm mainly going to give you some highlights from each of them, starting with DREAMS. I'm going to talk a little bit about the systematic map that we developed, specifically around the ecosystem service impact. I'm then going to talk about the two different workshops which we've had with scientists and stakeholders, and give you some overall key messages about what they think. So starting with the DREAMS project, we've now published a systematic map protocol and a fully developed systematic map. This is for various structures, including offshore wind, oil and gas, tidal wave, artificial reefs, and shipwrecks. So as a team, we went through and we sifted through around 2,000 odd different records from the published literature, which we then honed down to just under 1,000 articles relating to offshore structures' impact on ecosystem services. And this is now being used by various different aspects of the DREAMS project. But more recently, we've also translated these databases into ecosystem service effects, which is quite novel. I don't have time here to go and explain fully about how we did that, but this graphic just gives you a kind of overall example about what the database tells us in terms of how offshore wind structures in particular affect ecosystem services. And we broke it down into around 20 different ecosystem services, ranging from aquaculture all the way down to things like heritage, cultural services, and also biodiversity and habitat services, which can also be classed as supporting services. As you can see, the main take-home message is all the grey areas are kind of areas that we don't know about how offshore wind farms in particular impact on various different ecosystem services. So if we do want to implement environmental net gain policies, we really need to do some more primary kind of evidence to identify these different data gaps. This work is under review, but we'll hopefully be coming up with some more messages soon. We also went into the database and this time looked at the different decommissioning options within the database. Unfortunately, there wasn't that many around offshore wind, but we could get some take-home messages from oil and gas, artificial reefs and shipwrecks. So the colours indicate if the service was substantially enhanced, all the way to red, where the service was substantially degraded. These are based on different options for decommissioning, which we just heard from Joanne. There's various ways you can decommission structures. And the main message is that full removal was generally considered to be negative for a wide range of different ecosystem services, whereas removing part and adding protective structures seemed to be the most positive take for several different ecosystem services. And we also looked at a range of supporting services, which are not often included in ecosystem service frameworks. And again, it was kind of mixed, but the overall message was that there was kind of no impact or a kind of degraded impact based on various decommissioning options. We're still working this up, but it's a message. So moving on to the Insight Synthesis project, this time we did a series of workshops where we invited 40 different scientists across the Insight program, mainly from the areas of the UK, Europe, Australia, and the USA, where much of the work has been done around offshore structures. This time we asked them what scientists think about how we should restore and implement net gain actions. And it's important to note that the statements that I'm about to show you are backed up by quantitative evidence. So they're not just a series of statements. These were agreed by 40 different scientists from across the world. So first, we asked them about how different decommissioning options would move us towards OSPAR strategic objectives, which we heard from Joe. Currently, we have to remove all structures from the marine environment, but we wanted to better understand how we could move different policy objectives. What would be the outcome if we were to do these different policy objectives? So relating to 5 and 6, so most of the policy objectives were red. So scientists generally thought that various different decommissioning options were going to move us away from OSPAR strategic objectives. But in terms of environmental net gain objectives, so objective 5 and 6 about restoring ecosystem services and habitats, we actually find that scientists were generally much more positive. So they thought that we could maybe enhance, so there might be an enhancement effect of leaving structures in place in the environment. Although total removal was the least, scientists thought that would strongly move us away from these policy objectives, whereas abandonment of all was generally considered to be the highest or most beneficial. And if we look at preventing habitat loss, which has relevance to environmental net gain, scientists generally thought that this would take us towards that policy objective. This time we asked them about life below water, so the SDG, strategic objectives. And if we look at the objectives specifically relating to environmental net gain targets, such as protecting and restoring ecosystems and increasing economic benefits, we again find that scientists generally had a quite positive overview that different decommissioning options would move us towards these targets. Although, again, total removal and repurpose in place were generally thought to be fairly negative. So the final set of workshops we did, this time asking what developers and stakeholders thought around environmental net gain and ecosystem services. We took a much smaller approach this time. Rather than a global approach, we were more interested in the UK's position on environmental net gain. So we had fewer numbers of stakeholders, but you can see from the middle of the screen the kind of variety of different people we had at these workshops. They were made up mainly of different stakeholders, policymakers and arm's length bodies. And we had a follow-up survey in 2020 to increase the stakeholder numbers onto around, I think it was around 30. And rather than asking questions around decommissioning, this time we were specifically interested in what they thought we should be doing in terms of prioritising ecosystem services and restoration actions. Because it's all well and good, the ecology and the literature telling us what to do, but we also need to have perspective from people on the ground who actually have to implement these policies. So I've just pulled out some of the key messages, mainly around offshore wind farms, because that was considered to be one of the most important areas from the stakeholders. Here we asked them which ecosystem services, conceptual or operational, should be further developed in order to better estimate environmental net gain impacts. And from the yellow, the light blue and the green, you can see that stakeholders were generally favourable. They wanted to include as many ecosystem services really as we could in the delivery of environmental net gain. They mainly considered things like fisheries, supporting nursery habitats, co-location with aquaculture, and also blue carbon to be some of the most important ecosystem services. And they were mainly concerned or interested in provisioning and supporting services. They seem to be less clear or less incentivized for things like cultural services and regulating services. So things like how offshore wind farms impact sediment flows, how they may impact view sheds and remediate wastes. And this uncertainty may be due to the fact that these services are quite hard to get a handle on or measure in any kind of quantitative way. We also asked them this time about if they could have certain restoration actions in the marine environment around offshore wind farms. What would they rank as the most important? And again, shellfish and mussel beds, co-locating them near offshore wind farms came out on top. But we also had some surprising results that they were interested in things like plankton and zooplankton, which are also not often considered in environmental net gain or biodiversity strategies. So that was quite an interesting find. And you can go down the list. And this particular group considered that bats and birds and marine mammals were quite well covered in terms of delivering environmental and biodiversity net gain. Not to say they're not important, just in this group, they felt that there was other areas of opportunity that we could take when developing things like metrics for environmental net gain. So in summary, the evidence synthesis from the DREAMS INSITE project so far has highlighted there's a very large number of gaps, specifically relating to man-made structure and ecosystem services. We found over 197 specific evidence data gaps that we need to be researched further if we are to start thinking about how we implement environmental net gain, specifically around offshore wind farms, which are increasing rapidly. In terms of what the scientists think, total removal of various structures was often considered the least favourable option, both for biodiversity and for ecosystem services. And this was also backed up by the evidence, what scientists thought. So both the evidence synthesis and the scientists came up with the same kind of opinions. Scientists also believed that regionally, complete removal of all man-made structures was the least likely to achieve OSPAR and SDG strategic objectives, which maybe means that we need to start rethinking about how we remove structures from the marine environment. And finally, from the developers and stakeholders, consideration of fisheries and aquaculture was consistently high priority when implementing environmental net gain, and provisioning services in particular seem to be very important. A clear message from the developers to stakeholders is that we need to consider environmental net gain in metrics, particularly alongside Natural England's biodiversity metric, and that we need to start thinking about how we assign values for ecosystem services and economic impact as well. And there's various metrics and tools that are currently being developed around environmental net gain, but I quickly just wanted to highlight one that we're developing specifically as part of the Dreams and UKIRK projects called ORIs, which will be looking at how offshore wind farms in particular impact on ecosystem services. And this will be building on a lot of the evidence synthesis work that was done in Dreams, and also probably implementing some of the insight synthesis work as well. So we're kind of at the prototype stage with that, but we're hoping by October this year we'll come up with a working tool that anyone who's interested, stakeholders, developers, or anyone can use. So I'll stop there. But if anyone's interested, please get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was really interesting. We sort of got a good flavour of the evidence in this area, but worryingly, you've stressed that there are a lot of gaps there. We also look at some of what the scientists and the stakeholders think, and there are a lot of interesting messages that you raise. So thanks very much for your talk. I'm going to pause momentarily, and we'll just glance across at what our illustrator has pulled out from the talks so far. As you can see, it's developing here. We've got some of the messages coming across through pictorial forms there, and I think we'll refer to that again as the webinar goes on. So thank you to our illustrator for that too. And if I move on now to our next speaker, Professor David Patterson from University of St Andrews.
Okay, thanks very much, Henk, and I hope people can see that screen okay. And so I'm actually talking today about the ViewComs project, which is run by Natalie Hicks down at Essex University, and a little bit also about more broad concepts in terms of offshore structures in the marine environment. The ViewComs project is very much about the impact of those structures, but also thinking about the future and how we can think about the best way of addressing net gain. I struggled to find a nice picture of an oil structure, but here we are. It's sunset, and that looks quite nice. If you actually look into the ecology of these systems, then actually they do develop an ecology quite rapidly, and any material that we put into the marine environment does become colonized pretty quickly, first by organic layers, then by the settlement of bacteria and then larvae, and then developing into quite complex three-dimensional systems. And there's a reasonable amount of study on that, varying across the world from the Gulf of Mexico to the North Sea. And of course, all of those systems are contextually dependent. But they definitely have an ecology, and they definitely have a role, especially in the localized marine environment. And people who study them show the diversity and the functionality of those systems is quite different from the surrounding habitat. So this would be a very common thing to use in teaching, North Sea food web. And this one is around the Bass Rock, which of course has been in the news recently because of the bird flu epidemic and the impact on the gannets that are such a worldwide important colony there. But this type of food web, which develops over many years, can also be seen developing around offshore oil structures. And of course, there are some subtle differences in terms of the succession, the time, and the structures because of the variation in hydrodynamics and forces in an open lattice as opposed to a solid rock surface. Nevertheless, the same components are there. But of course, added to that are the additional factors such as pollution, noise, light, chemicals, and the presence of drill cutting piles. But one thing to say is that legislation over the years has begun to look at some of those effects and mediate them in terms of the nature of the chemicals that can be used, the way that light is directed, and the control on operations, which is becoming more stringent. So there has been a response to some of those effects. But in terms of the FUECOMS project, we're looking at the bigger impacts of those structures on the surrounding habitats. And that includes data analysis that exists from data that has already been collected using statistical modeling. But today I'm concentrating mainly on the fieldwork and lab analysis, since we're able to collect new data through sampling campaigns and bring material back for mesocosm studies. So the fieldwork and analysis has been conducted around the Northwest Hutton and Miller platforms. And there are contextual differences between those as well. Northwest Hutton was completed in terms of decommissioning in 2009 and has a 45-meter span above the seabed in place, whereas Miller was finished relatively more recently in 2018 and only has 20 meters of material above the seabed. So already there are contextual differences between those decommissioning programs. In terms of looking at the impacts of those areas since that decommissioning, we're looking at biodiversity across a wide sweep of organisms, from the microbial, molecular to macrofauna. And we're fortunate to be able to fund some PhD students from this work as well, looking at eDNA and blue carbon, along with heavy metals, nutrients, etc. So quite an extensive sampling campaign. In terms of the results, they're coming in rapidly, and we already have molecular analysis that's available, showing that there are differences in community function with distance from the sites. And these are just looking at the relative abundance of different functional bacterial assemblages as you increase the distance from the decommissioned platform, and Miller on the left and Northwest Hutton on the right. Particularly in terms of the functional attributes, such as the decrease in sulfate reducers as you move away from the platform, and increase in nitrogen cycling species with increasing distance. So there's this change in balance of the assemblages in response to the contextual conditions. Macrofauna was also analysed, and this is more traditional, I guess, than the molecular analysis. And these results suggest that the impact of those platforms, as we can see now, is not huge. There are differences in the number of species as you move away from the Northwest Hutton platform, but only towards the north there is a relative decline in species diversity away from the platform, which might be surprising. On the south side, there is very little change in the number of species with distance from the platform. And in Miller, the results aren't probably exactly comparable, because we were using grab samples from there, which we were not able to complete on the north side of the platform, so there's limited data. However, there's no strong evidence that there is a particular change due to proximity of the platform, except in both cases we had a slightly anomalous result at about 1,600 meters, where relative diversity was lower. And we're not sure what the reason for that is. But it may be impact from other things such as fisheries. In terms of biodiversity, using the Shannon Diversity Index, again, there was no clear evidence of an effect of the proximity of the platforms within the distances we measured. So you might consider this to be relatively good news. And we will be continuing this work with a cruise in the summer, which will be more to do with the offshore wind farms and in cooperation with Ørsted, looking again at a suite of different environmental indicators around those platforms. So we have to be thankful for the INSITE programme for allowing us to do this work in the detail that we've been managing to do. But I wanted to say a little bit more about the idea of net gain and why we're pursuing this and why this is being funded, why we have this legislation and what is the science. Joanne and Stephen have gone through some of those aspects in excellent detail. And we know that OSPAR at the moment, as Stephen mentioned, requires the removal of platforms unless there's derogation. But the fundamental question, is this a good thing? Is this removal the optimal approach to handling decommission? And it's interesting to note that different parts of the world come to different conclusions. And you also shouldn't consider that the bottom right-hand panel, this open sea, is without impact, because it isn't. We have the other aspects of the use of the environment, such as fisheries, to consider. So conceptually, for net gain, what we would like to see is an improvement, as Joanna was defining. Often we use a baseline for that. We look for an outcome where there is an increase in functionality, biodiversity, or some aspect of the environment we consider to be good, whether it's indicator species or a more inclusive metric. So we want to travel from a baseline condition to have a good outcome, or at least be neutral. Although now in the terms of net gain, we're often asking for more than simple neutrality, but certainly we don't want a reduction in the functionality and health of the system. This isn't as easy as it sounds because we have a real problem. One of the problems is, what do you take that comparison against? What are the baselines that are acceptable in terms of understanding these systems? If we look at change over time, then it depends very much on the stance we take, where we are starting from. And the further back we go in the North Sea, the bigger change we would see. So that decades, months, and years are quite different in terms of how we analyse the current system and what we expect to see as good environmental status. And also a number of people mentioned, hotspots in biodiversity or the biodiversity that platforms provide. But what spatial scale are we talking about, and how important are those islands in the middle of the North Sea? So we're left with problems, both in determining what we mean by net gain and also the nature of what we compare it against. There is evidence in the literature that some of that recovery to pre-disturbance conditions takes quite a long time. So we might be looking at decadal scales for expecting recovery. And that recovery can be different in terms of how we judge it, whether we're thinking about biodiversity or functionality of the system. With the microbial analysis, we might not see much change in the actual diversity, but quite a lot of change in the functionality. And we don't know that yet from the macrobenthos analysis. So one thing I just want to think about is in terms of our scientific knowledge and the policy that we demand from our governments and society. If we think back in time, then scientific knowledge and policy were probably in concert. But as the environmental challenges have increased, if we follow this green line in policy development, we're demanding more and more policy in order to protect ourselves in terms of what we're doing to the planet. And scientific knowledge is developing rapidly. But Stephen mentioned the gaps that we have. And I think recognizing that sometimes is critically important. We talk about the holistic paradigm, we talk about systems, and we talk about whole system development. And we're asked to deliver that. But the reality is that we're not actually at the stage of being able to fill in all of these gaps. So we sometimes have to make decisions on the basis of what we think is best, rather than a complete scientific portfolio of knowledge. We can't yet characterize entire ecosystems. So we can work towards the ecosystem and holistic approach, but we still just make measurements and analyze the diversity or the functionality they represent. So we have to allow a reasonably flexible approach, sometimes taking a lead from the policy that drives the science and making these decisions because it makes intuitive sense. But we need to check. And monitoring is not just for Christmas. We need to continue developing the science to help protect this approach. It is happening, and we see a number of papers increasing with time, looking at the ecology of offshore structures. And I'm sure we'll now see an increase in those papers dealing with net gain and how we adapt to that. But the challenge is huge. We have a lot of sites being opened for wind farm development, also new licenses for North Sea oil and gas. And we need to bring some of this thinking together to understand what we really want. In addition to that, we have the political storm, which is that we have the law that we apply at the moment, but with Brexit, a lot of those bills will be reconsidered and there may be changes, and a lot of work is required before all EU law is sunset in the United Kingdom. And so our colleagues in policy will also have their hands full. And so the scientific community is going to have to recognize that and work hard to provide the information that's needed in a timely and understandable fashion. And I'll just thank all of the FUECOMS team and for INSITE for running the seminar and this invitation, and special thanks to Mel, Ben and Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your talk and for drawing together those parallels, quite importantly, between policy and science, and creating the different sort of possibilities of how those can relate and connect to one another, as well as that, stressing the importance of monitoring, which I think is essential for detecting the kind of changes that we anticipate with any restoration work and net gain work. So another good talk, and we'll move on now to some questions and answers for all of our panel, please. So if our panelists can turn on their videos again, please. We've also got the illustrator, which should appear as a thumbnail in your screens. So for the next wee bit, I will walk through some of the questions that you've posed during the webinar and address that to some of the speakers. So thank you all for upvoting them as well. I'm going to just start off with the most upvoted question, which is essentially about marine, essentially about man-made structures. Phil Bulcott's here saying that removal is necessary. The biggest limiting factor on most biodiversity is related to pressure. But do we have enough evidence to suggest that connectivity is a sufficient limiting factor in restoration? Or should we concentrate instead on pressures, human pressures, natural pressures in the most suitable habitats? So I think what Phil's getting at here is basically the difference between suitable areas of suitable habitat versus the small areas of what he's saying are unsuitable habitat that are immediately in the vicinity of the man-made structures, and it relates to connectivity. So I will ask this question as it's related to connectivity to Joe, please. So Joe, I suppose the question is, do we have enough evidence to suggest that connectivity is a limiting factor in restoration? And if you could talk a bit about that, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm 100% understanding the question, but I'll talk a bit more. So the evidence at the moment that we're generating in the Chasans project, it's very early stages. So I'm not sure I can answer specifically the question you're asking there, but I think the work we're doing will be able to, in the next 12 months, give a much clearer answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is a bit of a tricky question. There are a few things embedded in there, so I understand that. Could maybe say something, this is a restoration aspect. If I could ask Charlotte then, just to comment on this. So this is basically the idea of focusing efforts on improving the conditions in suitable areas of suitable habitat that don't have structures on them, versus thinking about the areas that do have suitable habitats. The areas that do have man-made structures already on them. I think that's what Phil's getting at, and it might be interesting to hear from your work.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts of that I could comment on. I think in relation to looking at areas that are suitable for restoration, that obviously links directly into the project that we ran last year and that hopefully will continue, MAREPO, so the marine restoration potential, where we looked at threatened and declining habitats and where the environmental parameters are suitable for their potential restoration, whether that be through passive removal of pressures or whether that be through kind of active intervention of going out and trying to create that habitat. Obviously, the further offshore you get, the harder that gets. So yes, that's in its very early stages, but we have come up with some kind of areas where it would be more suitable to try and restore some habitats than others, as I mentioned earlier. I think in terms of the small areas, so if I've got this right, I guess what we're looking at when you're looking at kind of man-made infrastructure such as turbines or rigs or things that are present in the marine environment as those kind of almost like small islands where organisms can therefore kind of they find their refugia and their niches to exist. That is present, and you also get that naturally on rocks and kind of natural structures in the marine environment. So I think there's a question, and I don't know the answer to this, but there's a question around that connectivity, and I guess this is part of the question as well. Is that a limiting factor in terms of restoration? Do we need those kind of hopping stones across the North Sea? I wouldn't be able to comment at this time, but I think there probably is something to think around that and something to kind of understand the kind of implications of that. Yeah, I don't have the answers. Maybe others on the call who have more of an academic background would have the answers to that one. I can see maybe David looking like he might want to come in.
That's fine, Charlotte. Thank you. No. Well, I actually was going to move on to David next, and this is a question that's more about sort of climate change. As you were sort of looking into sort of like longer timeframes in your talk, David, a question from Beth Scott, just wondering that the effects of climate change seem to be missing in terms of our considerations with net gain, at least within the confines of the webinar now. But more broadly speaking, would you be able to comment, David, on how predictable changes that are predictable in the environment can be brought into net gain protocols of the future?
Well, I love the word predictable. How predictable are all the changes? Yes, we'll see changes in species distribution. But interestingly, we did an analysis of macrobenthic data from Shetland, which spans back to 1978, looking for changes in terms of things like thermal tolerance of the species, and this with us Mike Burrows, and we didn't find it. We would have predicted to find it. So, these predictions are not certain. However, environments will change. And I guess the question is whether that functionality and change can be incorporated into our understanding of what's happening with offshore structures. And if you did that in isolation, if you only looked at the structures, and you didn't compare with systems that are affected by climate change, we would get the wrong answers. So yes, we should be thinking in the long term about how climate change will affect those systems. But I think at the moment, the gaps in knowledge that we have are more fundamental than that. And so that will be something that we should consider. But I think all of the speakers today have pointed out that there are areas of work I think we'd need to concentrate on more. Things like deciding on those metrics for net gain. Net gain on land is much easier. We can see the organisms, we can understand the systems. But talking to developers who are looking for net gain offshore is much tougher, because how do you judge that net gain? And in fact, because the North Sea particularly is so exploited, you might not be gaining as much as you should, because you're using that baseline that is already a pretty low bar. So sorry, Beth, that's probably not the best answer you were expecting, but that's what I can give you at the moment.
Well, if I could perhaps ask a follow-on question to that, David, it's in a similar vein. It's posed by Flora Kent, and it continues on from what you were saying. So it's essentially about the differences between inshore and offshore restoration work. So there are a lot of examples of inshore restoration work going on, but Flora's saying, well, how viable is that offshore? If we have to monitor that offshore, would you be able to comment on that maybe?
Yeah, I think there's different levels to that. Inshore again is this transitional area where we can see things, and the technology to put things in place and monitor is slightly easier. And I guess a great example is seagrass restoration, and there are a number of projects doing that, and you can see the outcome of those quite quickly. The further you go offshore, again, the harder it is to say what that system should be like. When we've got marine protected areas that have lasted for a while, then we begin to get a better benchmark of what the actual system should look like. But when you've got regular disturbance, that's tougher to do. But we need that because we require the outcome from the fisheries. But I think Flora is exactly correct. It is much tougher to look at that restoration offshore. But there are people thinking about it. And if you look at some of the work that's been done on things like artificial reefs, the one off SAMS, and also the idea of this rigs to reefs where you do create habitat, it has worked in different parts of the world, and you can see localized net gain there. You get into an argument here about whether it's legitimate to consider the biodiversity on an oil rig as real biodiversity because it's actually something we put in place. In a sense, that doesn't matter. It's still biodiversity. It's still functional. It's still doing things. So there is a net gain implicit in that biodiversity. So there will be structures you could put out. There would be interventions you could make, but probably the best of them is to protect those areas and allow nature to take its course. But we're looking at that, I guess, and there are some political moves towards that. But it's difficult because we need food and we need energy.
Good to know. Thank you. I'd like to move a question to Stephen, please. This is more about MPA, Stephen, and I know a lot of your work in the Dreams and Synthesis projects is very, very broad in what you've covered. And so Karen Millichip's question relates to sort of any consideration to do with impacts or benefits, but specifically within MPAs. And the MPA network, but benefits and impacts for biodiversity when thinking about leaving structures in situ in the wider environment. Would you be able to comment about that?
I can certainly have a go. We didn't specifically ask the question about MPAs in the Dreams project, although in the 2 stakeholder workshops, which I talked about, we did ask specific questions about should we be incorporating net gain into highly protected marine areas and such, and the consensus was generally yes. We also asked things around the fact that offshore structures can be de facto artificial reefs, which many people were in support of, and there's current arguments that we should place offshore structures such as offshore wind farms in MPAs, And again, from the workshops we did, there was a general consensus that might be a good thing. In terms of the environmental benefits for doing that, they might be similar, but the one that we've kind of focused in on is the fisheries kind of aspect, in terms of that some of the environmental benefits might stop. Trawling might have to stop if it's co-locating with floating offshore wind farms, or if it's well, the legislation is different in different parts of the world. In the UK, currently, certain fisheries can go in and take things, but as we transition to different things like floating wind or other structures, there might be a complete ban on certain benefits like fisheries, recreation, and other services. So we are beginning to look at that. It's quite complicated, as you imagine, but there is work beginning to think about how we can best optimize, I guess, different services between things like highly protected MPAs, normal MPAs, and co-locating structures within MPAs. So there's a lot of work going on.
A lot of discussions in that area, as you know. Yes. It's all in flux at the moment still, isn't it? Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to ask Joe a question again. Joe, this time it's quite an interesting one posed by Celestia. About if you could go back in time and advise the oil and gas industry on their initial designs for infrastructure, bearing in mind that this is infrastructure to be decommissioned one day, what would the key inputs be? What would your advice be to that industry to maximize environmental benefits?
Yeah, we're getting some really interesting questions today. I think going back in time, one thing that didn't happen with oil and gas was that they could have thought about that area where they are, that footprint and the exclusion zone that they occupy, and use that in a beneficial way to support biodiversity, by thinking carefully about additional either sediment layers or modules or structures that would enhance the biodiversity. And I think that's kind of where we need to go now in the future. You know, we didn't have the opportunity to do it then, but that's what we should be trying to do now. You know, it's a missed opportunity, and it could help a lot with other targets, environmental targets that we're trying to meet in this changing world. So that's my view on it anyway.
If only we could go back in time, Joe. But we can bring some of these things into future developments, I'd hope. I've got a question for Charlotte now, please. It's a little bit about timelines. You might have more of an inside track on the timelines for when marine net gain requirements are likely to be implemented. It's from Vincent Oppitz.
Yeah, I can give you a little tiny bit more on that. So just very briefly, I'm going to say that so terrestrially and down to mean low water, biodiversity net gain will be mandatory from November this year, as I said. In terms of the timeline for marine, it's at a much earlier stage. The consultation on the kind of aims and principles of net gain went out last year, and there's a summary of the responses to that that's already out. And then DEFRA's response will be upcoming for that. In terms of the time frame, it really depends on where DEFRA go with this following their response to the consultation. And I think at that point we would have more information. I don't have much more in terms of other than it's quite early stages, and it does take a little bit of time to get these policies brought in, as well as kind of making sure that we're working with all the kind of stakeholders and parties, relevant parties that are going to be affected by kind of this policy. And we're working with DEFRA to kind of help them with any information and evidence they might need on that. but it is there. It is their policy, and it's also at this point might be worth just mentioning that net gain as a term and biodiversity net gain as a term refers to, so biodiversity net gain refers to that specific policy that DEFRA has put in place. Obviously, there isn't a marine net gain policy yet, so the definitions around that are a little more vague, but I see the term net gain being used quite broadly here to mean kind of any so on this call and many calls, any environmental or biodiversity or kind of nature improvement, and I think that's probably fine at the moment because the policy isn't defined, but as that comes in, I guess that definition will be laid down a bit more in concrete, and we'll have something a little more specific to work from.
Right. Thank you. A quick follow-on question from Peter Oliver about the ORIES system, ORIES. Is this something you're familiar with, or anyone else on the panel?
If somebody knows what the acronym is,
it was Stevens.
I think that was our tool, ORIES tool.
Okay. Well, Stephen, in that case, would you be able to shed some light for Peter here about whether or not that could be adapted for other offshore structures, not just offshore wind?
Great question. Yes, it can. We've currently got funding to develop it for offshore wind farms, which we're hoping to build the prototype and test it this year. So by October, we're hoping to have it working for offshore wind farms. But it is based on the DREAMS and INSITE databases, so the evidence synthesis that we've gathered for other structures. So we're hoping to adapt the prototype so that we can use it for hopefully oil and gas, tidal wave, and maybe shipwrecks and artificial reefs, but certainly oil and gas and tidal and wave. But that won't be till probably at least next year.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'll move on to another question then. This is specifically for David Patterson now, from Daniel Wood, about, do you think we have the science yet to effectively monitor an ecosystem and all of its complexities?
No.
In a nutshell.
No, I'll expand further. It's exactly
what's needed.
I tried to put that in context. No, we can't monitor an entire ecosystem. We can't monitor an entire human. What we do is that we have a concept that we should include as much variation and measure as much of the variation within a system as possible. But what we do is we prioritize what we think will be most important. And so, for instance, for offshore wind, birds are a big issue. Whereas for, say, pipeline development, it's the nature of the substratum and the benthos. I mean, we have to be flexible. We don't measure everything everywhere. So it's a question of agreeing how much we can actually monitor and what are the critical aspects to monitor in those different systems. But we roll that together now by using terms like natural capital or ecosystem function or ecosystem services. So we're heading in the right direction, but we shouldn't be naive and say that actually we can deliver all of these different things. Things hit us from the side sometimes. We don't understand their importance until it's too late. Turbulence might be one, and how you break down things like stratification in the water column with structures where there was stratification before and how that might change the primary productivity of the system. That's something nobody's mentioned yet today, but it was in the analysis that Stephen mentioned. People were talking about the influence of turbulence and how that might affect ecosystems. So no is the short answer.
It's complicated, yes. Thanks for taking that one on. I've got a question for all the speakers now. It's a very popular question from Ed Bolger. Apologies if I mispronounced that, but it's to ask you all about your speakers on strategic net gain via a marine recovery fund that developers would pay into, and do you think this would have advantages over each developer securing their own net gain procedures and approaches individually, or would would it possibly be more advantageous to do something on a more strategic level that could be better coordinated across an ecosystem, say? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's another straightforward answer, yes.
Oh.
And I think it would be better coordinated, but it's a little bit like the OSPAR decision. A blanket decision is usually challengeable in different contexts. So I think a fund like that would be very good, but there may be occasions where local activity is sensible. But that could be judged by, an expert panel in control of those funds. So it might be that if you had a fund like that, people would request something, to be done in a specific area, and that could be taken in the round with other developments in the region. And coming back to something Joanne said earlier, is that, if we started from the beginning, then the survey methods, etc., and how we judge things would all have been coordinated. And we've lost a lot of data, and we've lost a lot of information because they never were. So if you put things together and you can coordinate the response, the methodologies and the outcomes, then you get advantage in that, I think.
I think, Henk, if it's all right, if I can come in. I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying there, David. It makes a lot of sense. Again, with marine net gain policy, it's early days at the moment. The consultation last year asked some questions around kind of strategic versus site-based net gain, and there were kind of pros and cons for that. And you can see kind of some of the responses that came through, if you fancy a read of those responses. I think there are some pros and cons to it. I think what people talked about in some of those responses were not wanting to disincentivize developers from looking at what they can do in order to offset their impacts and leave the environment in a measurably better condition. So not wanting to kind of disincentivize that by just paying into a pot of money, and also not wanting to decouple the impact from the offset and the kind of mitigation, and then that added benefit on top of that, not wanting to decouple the impact from what you need to do to kind of leave the environment in that better condition. So I think there are some tricky questions around that, but also understanding that in the marine environment you do get greater connectivity, and it's much harder than it would be on land in terms of just, I'm going to use a basic example, but just kind of planting a few more trees because you've had to cut some trees down. It's not quite the same as the marine environment, especially people have already mentioned, once you get into kind of monitoring this, you can't just go out and count those trees. You need to have special kit to do so, and it's very hard. And the kind of natural variability is high. So I think all those things play into it, and there will be this need to compromise and work out what's going to be best. I think personally, and this is my personal opinion, there is probably space for both a site approach and a strategic kind of approach where you work together as a group of developers in a particular area of the English seas.
And as a quick follow-on to that, who do you think should design those measures? Do you or anyone else on the panel have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think from my point of view that hasn't been decided yet, and I think it's something that will come out as this policy is talked about more with DEFRA and who they're kind of working with on this. So yeah, I think that's yet to come out in the wash.
Right, yeah, that's good. Yeah, really interesting. Well, we've got just about 5 minutes left. Only time for a few, one or two more questions, and then I'd like to go to our image that's been developing as we've been going along. The top voted question, I'll go for that. That's from Jeremy, and I think this might link in quite well to some of the things that you were mentioning, Joe, about sort of restoration projects. And would you be able to comment on how close are we to seeing partial rig, artificial reef creation acceptance by governance / government, I think, in terms of timescale? I mean, are we likely to see sort of partial rigged artificial reefs being accepted? And well, have you got any thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, it's a great question, and another one that I don't really know the answer to, but I think it would be really interesting to have almost a stepping stone by having a research project around this in the North Sea. And I think if we can bring people together, like-minded people, and then try to do whatever derogations needed to have an experimental site, I think that might open up a lot of opportunities for scientists and for the offshore engineers to work together. Some of the things that we think might not be that easy to do or workable, engineers might be looking at that in a very different way. And at the moment, we're not getting that close coupling that we need at the site level, I think, to really hammer out some of the issues and understand what the real issues are. And, I just think it'd be such a great thing to do, and it might build confidence as well, to a bigger consideration of what makes sense going forwards. So that's my perspective on it, Henk.
Thanks, Joe. It kind of leads on to our last question that I'd like to pose to all panelists. We've probably got time just for one or two quick answers to it. And it's actually from Paul Summerfield, another one of our INSITE researchers. And it's building on what you've said, Joe. So you've got this example, but it's thinking broader about measurable net gain and the timescales in which we want to see changes. And Paul's opening this up, like, are we looking for changes over 5 years or 100 years? He's interested. Well, I mean, he's throwing the cat among the pigeons, and sort of are we interested in short-termism, or are we better building longer-term goals into the whole concept of net gain? Is anyone willing to comment on that?
Happy to do so.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. There's a problem of matching political ambition with scientific timescale. And so again, the short answer is we should be looking at long term, because that's how the environment develops. So it's decadal. It's not so quick. So you can introduce something and it will look great for a year, and then it could all die out, and that's pointless. We should be looking in the longer term. But also the political will tends to be focused on the short term because of how our political system works. So it's hard to get those metrics and say, right, we want to come back and look at this in 10 years and 20 years, not in 1 year and 2 years. And that's why I made the slightly facetious monitoring is not just for Christmas. You need to keep it going. You need to understand what the changes are. So that's a good question.
And that's a good point, I think, to wrap things up as well, that there's a difference in sort of, the short-term goals of government, but increasingly government is also looking at longer-term programs, such as 25-year environment plan and other things beyond that. So I think we are going in the right direction. And it's great to have all of our panelists today sharing their views in this topic. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed the webinar as we've been going through these, and that it's going to open up new conversations that will shed more light in this topic as time goes on. It's a very dynamic area. So thank you, everyone, for dialing in today. Just one thing to leave you with is this great illustration that our illustrator's been drawing as we've been going along. We'll make this available, as we will the video of today's webinar, on the INSITE website in a couple of weeks' time. So once again, I'd like to thank you for coming, and thank all the speakers for some great talks, and look forward to seeing you at the next one, which I believe is the 25th of May, and it'll be on offshore wind. 25th of May, offshore wind. Thank you, everybody. See you again next time.